In 1874, the Athens Lunatic Asylum, now known as the Ridges, opened its doors to the public. At its peak, the asylum served 15 counties in southern Ohio, boasting hundreds of patients. Unfortunately, like many early mental health facilities, the history of the Ridges is rife with neglect, abuse, and tragedy. In the early days of the asylum, mental health was a largely misunderstood field. According to an 1877 report found in the Ohio University Digital Archives, 3 suicides had occurred in the 4 years since the asylum's opening, which the report blames on overcrowding. The sources of mental illness ranged from jealousy to being kicked by a horse. Epilepsy was also a major cause of insanity, and those who had it were viewed as violent. Not only that, but a whole class of insanity causes were dedicated to things largely only experienced by women, and in 1877, 52 women were staying in the asylum for things like life changes and menstrual derangement. The asylum also offered many therapy options to treat patients, some of which we now know are ineffective or inhumane, like hydrotherapy, electroshock therapy, treatment with alcohol consumption, and lobotomies. This is Building 20, in which Dr. Walter Freeman would visit twice a year to perform 208 ice pick lobotomies, in which he would insert a metal pick in between the patient's eye socket to separate the prefrontal cortex and the frontal lobe. Many of his patients would die. Others would never be the same. Daily life in the asylum was not much different. In the mid-1950s, one unnamed patient wrote a narrative of her daily life in the asylum. The patient describes the cruelty she underwent, likening it to a prison. She says nurses were harsh, that they forbade the patient from talking, singing, and religious practices. One day, the patient was assigned to shock treatment and, having heard terrible things about the procedure, made sure to place a will where nurses could find it. After one session in which she almost did not wake up, her electroshock therapy session ceased. Behind me are the female wards, where the unnamed patient likely would have lived. She worked in the kitchen in the rear basement. Despite the cruelty that she underwent, she remarked that with the introduction of psychotropic drugs, the hospital's practices were becoming more humane. Indeed, mental health practices were improving, albeit slowly. In the 50s, Thorazine was introduced, marking a new age of psychotropic treatment. Electroshock therapy became completely eliminated by the 70s. The institution began to focus more on treating patients so they could go home, instead of staying at the asylum long term. Due to a decreased patient population, buildings and cottages at the asylum closed. In 1972, a federal court ruled that asylums could no longer use patients for unpaid labor, and the farms and dairy barn closed. The asylum began to decline, eventually closing in 1993.
The place never closed, it just moved. It still is in existence. There still is one of the biggest and best state psychiatric facilities here in Athens. There is a place in town out on the west side past Oblinus called Appalachian Behavioral Healthcare. In 1993, we took about 150 patients and staff and moved into that building from up on the ridges and been there ever since.
Today, the former administrative building of the asylum is the Kennedy Museum of Art, with the dairy barn becoming the Dairy Barn Southeastern Ohio Cultural Arts Center. The Athens Asylum operated for 119 years, treating thousands of people and demonstrating an unfortunate nationwide history of abuse against the mentally ill.